My family has worked this land for 3 generations, a legacy stitched into every fence post my grandfather hammered into the ground back in 1947 with his war savings, building his American dream from sunrise to sunset. He passed it to my father, who taught me the art of farming, caring for animals, doing things right, until it became my own. For decades, it was just us and a few other farming families out here, our lives tied to the soil, until 2 years ago when million-dollar homes with manicured lawns sprouted up nearby, their gleaming windows glaring at my grazing cows. At first, we tried to be neighborly. I even invited them to our annual harvest barbecue. But last month, a certified letter from the new HOA landed in my mailbox, claiming my cows were dragging down property values and demanding changes. That same morning, I caught Sarah Matthews, the HOA president, marching across my pasture in designer heels, a thick folder under her arm and 2 board members trailing her, snapping photos of my barn like it was a crime scene. She waved some property maintenance ordinance in my face, her voice dripping with condescension as she listed violations. My historic barn an eyesore, the roosters crowing a disturbance, insisting my cows had to go within 30 days. But she didn't expect me to pull out my grandfather's yellowed zoning papers, stamped as protected agricultural land since 1943, his foresight shielding us from exactly this kind of push. Her face flushed red as I explained, and then Tom Miller, our retired neighbor and former county judge, ambled over, took one look at her documents, and laughed. He'd seen this before with 2 other farmers pressured to sell. The night before, my security cameras had caught something odd. 3 figures with flashlights creeping along my property line, taking pictures. Something wasn't right, and I was about to unravel how deep it went. Later that evening, Bill Thompson from the Carson family farm called. He'd gotten the same letter, same demands, their 3-generation legacy now unsuitable for the neighborhood. We weren't alone in this fight, and Tom's knowing tone hinted he had a plan. I couldn't shake the feeling this was bigger than cows or property values. It was a scheme, and those HOA folks had no idea they'd picked the wrong farmers to mess with. I started digging through my security footage from the past month, spotting a black SUV parked at my property's edge every Wednesday night like clockwork. First, I thought it was kids, but zooming in revealed Sarah Matthews and a stranger photographing my land. Then, flipping through the HOA's complaint letters, I noticed something off. Signatures from Mrs. Johnson and Mr. Peterson, folks I knew who'd always been friendly. I showed up at Mrs. Johnson's door with one. She went pale. She'd never signed it, never complained. Tom connected me with Jack Wilson, a local newspaper guy investigating similar cases. Family farms selling cheap after HOA pressure, luxury developments rising in their place. And that night my doorbell rang. Linda, Sarah's shaky assistant, handed me an envelope with a USB drive, whispering she couldn't sleep knowing their plans. Inside that envelope was dynamite, recorded board meetings, emails, a development plan targeting every agricultural property in the county, not just mine. Those midnight meetings, fake complaints, and sudden pressures on farmers were threads in a larger web. And as I connected the dots, I realized this wasn't about property values anymore. It was war on our way of life. These people had no clue what they'd started, but with truth and a community behind me, they were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. That Sunday morning, I sat down with a cup of coffee and plugged in the USB drive Linda had slipped me, my heart pounding as the files loaded. There was Sarah Matthews in the HOA office, laughing with a man in an expensive suit, her husband James Matthews, CEO of Sunrise Development Corporation. They were plotting to force out every farmer in the area, waiting for property values to tank so they could swoop in and buy everything for next to nothing. James said with a smirk. It hit me hard. His company had been snatching up foreclosed farms across 3 counties, and every complaint, every violation, every late-night inspection was their orchestrated weapon. The next recording showed Sarah laying out their strategy. Start with the Miller farm, pressure Thompson's place, save the stubborn one with the cows. Me, for last, complete with a timeline for each farm's downfall, mocking my grandfather's deed like it was a relic they'd bury. My blood boiled as I listened, but I took it all to Tom, our retired judge neighbor who pored over the files, his face darkening with every page. This wasn't just harassment. He said, It was criminal. Manipulating property values, falsifying documents, a pattern they'd perfected in 2 other communities, leaving farmers devastated. Word spread fast among us farming families. Bill Thompson's daughter, a city lawyer, started digging into Sunrise's past developments. Everyone followed the same playbook. Aggressive HOAs, forced sales, luxury homes rising from the ashes. But this time, they'd left evidence, and I wasn't about to let them erase what our families had built. The local news broke the story on a Tuesday morning. Local HOA caught in farmland scheme. Front page, with photos of my farm and those fake complaint letters. Sarah Matthews pulled into the HOA office to find reporters waiting, her composure cracking. That night's emergency town hall was electric. Farmers from across the county packed the room. Old Mr. Peterson, whose name was forged on a complaint, stood up teary-eyed, revealing his father lost their farm to the same scheme a decade ago. Then 3 HOA board members, Mary Collins among them, resigned on the spot, Mary handing over emails proving Sarah's manipulation, her voice trembling as she admitted they'd been pressured to vote against farms, not what they'd signed up for. The real bombshell came when a state investigator strode in, announcing they'd been tracking Sunrise Development's suspicious land deals statewide. All they'd needed was concrete evidence, and my security footage and that USB drive delivered it. The room went silent as he flashed surveillance photos of James Matthews meeting county officials late at night, the same officials fast-tracking zoning changes for his developments. Right there, he launched a full investigation into the HOA and Sunrise, and though Sarah and James skipped the meeting, their scheme unraveled on the evening news. Justice was creeping in, and watching their carefully laid plans crumble live on TV felt like the first taste of what was coming their way. Sunrise's master plan, when we got our hands on it, was worse than we'd imagined. A sleek corporate presentation mapping a 5-year takeover of our farming community into premium lifestyle estates. Every family farm marked for acquisition with chilling precision. My place was labeled, stubborn holdout, requires aggressive measures. Each surrender scheduled like a military campaign against rural America. Infiltrate HOAs, impose impossible rules, drive distressed sales. But their plan backfired spectacularly. Linda had been quietly gathering evidence for months. Meeting recordings, emails with corrupt zoning officials, even photos of cash changing hands in parking lots. And when the state attorney general saw it, things escalated fast. A memo from James himself bragging about modernizing 3 other farming communities into luxury sprawl sealing their fate. They thought they could bully us out. Instead, they'd lit a fuse under a farmer with cameras and a judge for a neighbor. The smoking gun came in the form of that memo from James Matthews, smugly boasting about how they'd turned 3 farming communities into luxury developments. These farmers are sitting on gold mines. They just need the right motivation to sell. And that motivation was systematic harassment, wielded through corrupted HOA power and a web of shell companies spanning 12 counties. They never saw it coming. A small-town farmer with security cameras and a retired judge neighbor bringing their empire down. But they'd underestimated us. And when James Matthews strutted onto my property one morning, flanked by 2 slick lawyers, checkbook in hand, it was their last desperate play. "Name your price," he sneered. "This development's happening whether you like it or not. You can leave rich or leave broken." The check had more zeros than I'd ever seen, but as I stood there, picturing my grandfather's hands on these fences, my father's lessons in the fields, I heard a truck door slam. Word travels fast out here. Bill Thompson rolled up with his daughter, the lawyer, then Tom, our retired judge, ambled over, and within minutes, half the farming community had gathered in my front yard. Someone recorded it all, the standoff going viral on social media. Matthews trying to buy us off, us standing united. Then Sarah Matthews appeared, pale as a ghost. While James waved his checkbook, my security footage of their midnight meetings was playing at the emergency county commissioners' meeting, exposing them to the world. The next week, our community fundraiser drew folks from across counties, families who'd lost farms to Sunrise, local businesses donating food and legal help, even city folks from the new homes who loved living near real farms, not another sterile development. And that video hit national news. sparking a ripple effect as other farming communities started sniffing out their own HOA ties to developers. The final HOA board meeting was a reckoning. We showed up in force. Farmers, locals, even some suburbanites who'd once backed the HOA, and one by one we laid out the evidence. Fake complaints, manipulated property values, those clandestine meetings. Sarah and James sat stone-faced as their own board turned on them, the room alive with the realization this wasn't just about my cows. It was about a way of life under siege across America. By the end, no one doubted what was at stake, and standing there, surrounded by neighbors, I knew we'd ignited something unstoppable, beyond the reach of any bribe. When the state investigation's findings dropped, it was more than justice. It was vindication for every farmer crushed by corporate greed. We'd uncovered one of the biggest land grab schemes in state history. Forged documents, rigged values, bribes to officials, a trail of ruined families like mine. I was in the barn when they arrested Sarah and James Matthews. Those designer suits and fancy cars useless now. Facing charges of conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, and falsifying documents. All nailed shut by my security footage of their late-night plotting with officials meant to protect us. The courthouse was packed for their arraignment, farmers from 3 counties filling the seats, some who'd lost everything, others next on the hit list. And when the judge, an old farmer's daughter herself, denied bail, the room thrummed with a quiet, hard-earned justice. But it went beyond 2 people caught red-handed. The investigation peeled back Sunrise Development's mask, revealing a network of big city investment firms gobbling up America's farmland through HOA manipulation, a playbook they'd honed across states. Our state representatives, watching closely, seized the moment, drafting the Heritage Farm Protection Act to shield agricultural land from HOA overreach, a law sparked by one stubborn farmer who wouldn't move his cows. Out here, they'd tried to break us. Instead, they'd forged a movement, and as I watched their house of cards collapse, I knew this was just the beginning of what we'd set in motion. The day we heard the first guilty verdict, local farmers gathered at my place. Bill Thompson brought his famous apple pie, and Tom, our retired judge neighbor, couldn't stop grinning. The state's attorney stood right where Sarah Matthews had first confronted me, announcing Sunrise Development's assets were frozen, their projects halted, their victims finally in line for justice. The national media latched onto it. Small farming community topples corporate land grab. And suddenly, our little corner became a beacon for standing up to greed. Other farming towns digging into their own HOAs for similar patterns. What started with my security cameras had snowballed into a heartland movement. The collapse of Sunrise exposing their shell companies and fake investment funds. Their whole operation crumbling like dry soil in a storm. But the real win wasn't their downfall. It was our community rising stronger than ever. Those HOA board members who'd resigned that chaotic night were replaced by folks who actually cared. Old Mrs. Johnson, falsely accused of complaining about my farm, took the president's seat and tore up those absurd agricultural regulations first thing, declaring, "This is farm country, and we're keeping it that way." The farm protection ordinance we'd fought for became a blueprint elsewhere. State reps from across the country called, wanting to know how we'd pulled it off. Our victory rippling outward as farmers and neighbors banded together to guard their heritage. Even those luxury developments Sunrise had planned got a twist. The new owners, instead of erasing us, partnered with local farmers to create agricultural integrated communities, celebrating the farms they'd once tried to hide, launching a weekly farmers market right where Sarah had dreamed of her clubhouse. My property's a sight now. Those cows they wanted gone still graze peacefully, but families from the new homes bring their kids to watch, learning where their food comes from. We've even started an educational program with the schools, proving people crave real farms over cookie-cutter sprawl. And those property values the HOA obsessed over. They've soared higher than anyone guessed. Turns out, protected farmland and a tight-knit community trump any golf course view. Every morning, I walk my fence line like my grandfather did, seeing something he couldn't have dreamed. A place that finally gets the worth of its farming roots, forged in a fight we never asked for but won together. Sarah and James Matthews, Last I heard, they're facing serious prison time, but their real punishment might be knowing their scheme didn't just fail, it backfired, making us tougher than ever. They tried to bully this old farmer off his land with fancy paperwork and shady deals. Instead, they united a community and rewrote state law. My cows aren't just livestock now, they're symbols of beating corruption and those soaring property values. That's thanks to honest farmers as neighbors. Sometimes the best view isn't some manicured estate. It's the strength of what makes America tick, right here in the dirt we refuse to abandon. Looking back, it's wild to think it all started with that HOA president stomping up to my fence, demanding I ditch my cows. Never did I imagine my security cameras would catch their midnight plotting, exposing a scheme that stretched far beyond my pasture. But that's how it goes out here. Mess with one of us and you mess with us all. 3 generations of my family poured their lives into this land, and no amount of designer heels or forged signatures could uproot that. The lesson they learned. Farmers don't fold easy, especially when truth on our side, and what they meant to destroy only grew stronger in the fight. Funny how their greed ended up proving the value of what they tried to take, leaving us with a legacy they'll never touch. It all kicked off that crisp morning when Sarah Matthews, the HOA president, strutted up to my fence, her designer heels sinking into the mud as she demanded I get rid of my cows, claiming they tanked property values. I'd been raised on this land, 3 generations deep, and never thought it'd come to this. My grandfather bought it in 1947 with every penny he'd scraped from the war, building each fence post by hand, his sweat turning this plot into his American dream. My father took it next, teaching me the rhythms of farming, cows, crops, the right way to live off the earth. For years, it was just us and a handful of farming families, until those fancy developments sprang up 2 years back, their million-dollar homes glaring at our barns, and suddenly we were the problem in their polished world. I tried playing nice at first, invited them to our harvest barbecue, shared a few beers. But then that certified letter hit my mailbox, all official and cold, saying my cows had to go. That same night, my security cameras caught 3 shadows with flashlights skulking along my property line, snapping photos like spies. Something stank worse than the barn, and the next day there was Sarah, folder in hand, flanked by 2 board members eyeballing my place like it was a dump. She rattled off violations, calling my grandfather's barn an eyesore, the roosters too loud, giving me 30 days to clear out. I pulled out those old zoning papers, stamped agricultural since '43, and watched her squirm as I explained how my granddad had locked this land down tight. She didn't count on that, or on Tom Miller, our retired judge neighbor, strolling over to back me up with a grin. Tom's laugh cut through her bluster. He'd heard of 2 other farmers down the road bullied into selling, and his tone told me this wasn't random. Later, Bill Thompson called from Carson Family Farm, hit with the same letter, 3 generations like us, now told their life didn't fit the neighborhood. We were in it together, and I couldn't shake the hunch this was bigger than a few cows. Those late-night camera catches were my first clue, and I started combing through footage, spotting a black SUV every Wednesday, Sarah and some stranger scoping my land. Then the complaint letters, signatures from folks like Mrs. Johnson, who swore she'd never written them, piled up, and when Linda, Sarah's assistant, slipped me that USB drive, trembling as she whispered about their plans, I knew we'd stumbled onto something rotten. The USB was a gold mine. Board meetings, emails, a hit list of every farm in the county, not just mine. Those midnight meetups, fake signatures, and pressure campaigns were all pieces of a machine gunning for our way of life, and connecting those dots lit a fire in me. They'd messed with the wrong farmer. I took it to Tom, who saw the criminal edge right off. Forgery, manipulation, a playbook they'd run elsewhere. And when Jack Wilson from the paper showed me how Sunrise Development, run by Sarah's husband James, turned farms into luxury sprawl, it clicked. This was a land grab, pure and simple. The news broke it wide open, town hall erupted with farmers spilling their guts, and that state investigator walking in with my footage sealed it. They thought they'd steamroll us, but they'd kicked a hornet's nest, and we were just getting started. That USB drive Linda handed me was a ticking bomb, and when I popped it into my laptop that Sunday morning, I saw Sarah Matthews in the HOA office, cackling with her husband James, Sunrise Development's CEO, as they mapped out how to tank our property values and snatch every farm in the area for peanuts. Start with Miller, then Thompson's. Save the stubborn cow guy for last, Sarah said, their timeline as cold as a corporate spreadsheet, even mocking my grandfather's deed, James chuckling. By the time they figure it out, it'll be too late. It was a gut punch. Sunrise had already swallowed farms across 3 counties, every HOA complaint and violation a calculated jab to drive us out, and my blood ran hot knowing they'd done this before, grinding family legacies into dust for their luxury estates. I hauled it all to Tom, our retired judge neighbor, who dissected those files like a surgeon. His face hardened as he muttered about falsified documents and property value scams, calling it bigger than harassment, straight-up criminal. Bill Thompson's lawyer daughter dug into Sunrise's past, finding the same pattern everywhere. HOAs turning vicious, farms selling cheap, Sunrise swooping in. The news hit like a thunderclap. Local HOA caught in farmland, farms foed, splashed across the front page. And Sarah's smug mask slipped when she rolled up to the HOA office, reporters swarming her. That night's town hall was a powder keg. Farmers packed the seats. Mr. Peterson choking up about his dad's farm lost to the same trick years back, and 3 board members quit on the spot. Mary Collins spilling emails proving Sarah's arm-twisting. Then the state investigator stormed in, saying they'd been tailing Sunrise's shady deals statewide. My security footage and that USB were the missing pieces, and he flashed pics of James schmoozing county officials at midnight, the same ones greasing zoning changes for his projects. He announced a full probe into the HOA and Sunrise right there, and by midnight, their unraveling was primetime news. Their master plan surfaced next, a slick presentation plotting a 5-year takeover of our community into premium lifestyle estates. My farm tagged, stubborn holdout, requires aggressive measures. Every move a siege on rural life. But Linda's months of secret recordings, emails, and cash handoff photos flipped the script, and the Attorney General pounced when they saw it. James Matthews tried one last swing, swaggering onto my property with 2 lawyers and a checkbook, barking, "Name your price. This is happening, rich or broken, your call." I stood there, the checks, zeros swimming in my vision, but then Bill's truck roared up. Tom strolled over, and soon half the community was in my yard. Someone filmed it, the video exploding online as Sarah showed up ashen, while our footage played at the county meeting. The fundraiser that followed was unreal. Families who'd lost farms to Sunrise drove hours to join us. Locals pitched in everything from pies to legal aid. Even new homeowners rallied, hatting the idea of another soulless sprawl. It hit national news. Other farming towns started sniffing their HOAs. And at the final board meeting, we laid out the evidence. Fake complaints, rigged values, midnight deals. Sarah and James watching their board turn, their perfect scheme collapsing as the room saw what was really at stake. Not just my cows, but a way of life they'd underestimated. The state investigation's findings landed like a hammer, cracking open one of the biggest land grab schemes in state history. Forged documents, cooked property values, bribes to officials, and a wake of shattered farming families. I was mucking out the barn when they cuffed Sarah and James Matthews. Their designer threads no shield against charges like conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, and falsifying records. My security footage of their late-night scheming with crooked officials the final nail. The courthouse buzzed for their arraignment. Farmers from 3 counties crammed in, some who'd lost it all, others next on the chopping block. And when the judge, a farmer's daughter with steel in her eyes, denied bail, you could taste the justice raw and real. But it wasn't just about them. Sunrise was a front for big city investment firms, a machine chewing up America's farmland through HOA puppets, a playbook they run state after state until we caught them cold. Our state reps didn't waste time. Watching this mess unfold, they drafted the Heritage Farm Protection Act, a law tailor-made to stop HOA overreach on agricultural land, all because one farmer wouldn't budge on his cows. The day the first guilty verdict dropped, we gathered at my place. Bill Thompson with his apple pie, Tom grinning ear to ear. As the state attorney stood where Sarah once had, declaring Sunrise's assets frozen, their developments dead, their victims lined up for payback. The story blew up nationally. Small-town farmers fell corporate giant. And our little fight became a rallying cry, other communities sniffing out their own HOA scams, a movement sprouting from my pasture's dirt. Sunrise's empire didn't just fall, it shattered. Shell companies, fake funds, all laid bare. But the real win was us coming back tougher, united. Those HOA board seats? The ones who quit got replaced by folks who get it. Mrs. Johnson, framed as a complainer, took the helm and shredded those anti-farm rules, vowing, "This is farm country and it's staying that way." Our ordinance spread like wildfire, state reps nationwide calling to copy it, farmers and neighbors everywhere linking arms to shield their roots. Even Sunrise's stalled developments flipped. The new owners teamed up with us, turning their plots into agricultural integrated communities, spotlighting farms instead of burying them, a farmer's market popping up where Sarah's clubhouse was supposed to sit. My land, alive now, cows still grazing, but kids from the new homes wander over, wide-eyed, learning food doesn't start at the store. We've got school programs going and those property values they fretted over. Skyrocketing, turns out, real farms and real people beat sprawl any day. Sarah and James are staring down prison bars, but their real defeats knowing their scheme didn't just flop, it forged us stronger. They tried to bulldoze me off with paperwork and backroom deals, and instead they birthed a law and a community that won't bend. My cows, symbols now of beating corruption, of proving grit pays, and every morning I walk my fence line like my granddad, seeing a place that finally knows its worth, a legacy they couldn't buy. They thought they'd erase us, but their greed lit up what matters. Those fancy estates they plan don't hold a candle to the view out here. A living testament to what keeps America strong, built by hands that wouldn't let go. It's hard to believe it all started with Sarah Matthews stomping up to my fence that morning, barking about my cows and property values. I never dreamed my security cameras would catch their midnight plotting, peeling back a scheme that stretched far beyond my land. 3 generations of my family poured their souls into this soil, from my grandfather's post-war dream in '47 to my father's lessons on farming right, and no HOA in heels was going to rip that out. Those early days of fancy homes popping up felt like a slow invasion, but when that letter hit, followed by shadowy figures on my footage, I knew this wasn't just about neighborly gripes. It was a calculated hit, and Linda's USB drop, packed with their dirty board meetings and hit lists, proved it. They wanted every farm in the county, and Sunrise Development, James Matthews' outfit, was the muscle behind it. The fight escalated fast. Tom, our ex-judge neighbor, saw the felony in their faked signatures and rigged values. Jack Wilson's reporting tied it to a statewide pattern, and that town hall showdown with farmers and turncoat board members spilling the truth flipped the script. The state investigators' entrance, armed with my footage, turned it into a full-on bust. Sunrise wasn't just them. It was a network of city fat cats, and their arrest was sweet, but the Heritage Farm Protection Act was sweeter. A law born from our dirt that's now a shield for farmers everywhere. Their master plan, to morph us into premium lifestyle estates, crashed when Linda's evidence and our unity hit back, and James' checkbook stunt in my yard, caught on viral video, only cemented their fall. The community rallied, old farmers, new neighbors, even city transplants, and what they meant to kill made us a national symbol. Now my land's a living story. Those cows still chew grass while kids learn their mooing means milk, not just noise. The new HOA, led by Mrs. Johnson, guards our roots and those Sunrise plots. They're farm-friendly zones now, a market buzzing where their clubhouse was slated. Property values soared, proving heartbeats greed. Sarah and James face jail, but their real loss is seeing their scheme strengthen what they targeted. My daily fence walk shows a place my granddad couldn't have pictured, a community that fought and won, its farming soul intact. They tried to bury us with slick tricks, and instead they handed us a megaphone, sparking a movement that's rewriting the game for rural America. This wasn't just about me or my cows. It was every farmer who's felt the squeeze, every acre they've tried to pave over. We turned their own weapons, cameras, truth, grit, into a reckoning, and when their empire folded, we didn't just survive, we thrived, showing the country what happens when you push folks who know how to stand. The view out here, cows dotting the fields, neighbors who have got your back. It's worth more than any luxury sprawl, a testament to what my family built and what we saved. They thought they'd cash in on our heritage, but they ended up proving its price, leaving my cows as quiet heroes and this land as proof that sometimes the little guy with a lens and a cause can change everything.